Like
Right.
NoFap, for example, is a cultural antibody
Yeah.
that emerged in response, in consequence to an addictive stimulus.
Yeah. Giving into your hedonistic whims is actually a result of worshipping the wrong thing.
How hard should it be for the median individual to find sufficient work that
First, understand what your goal and purpose in life is, and what is the thing that you're going to spend your whole life aiming towards.
Welcome back to Metaphysical Graffiti, the only Led Zeppelin and philosophy theme named podcast.
Yeah.
Cheers, man. It's good to be back.
Cheers.
Glad we're getting a weekly schedule doing this.
Absolutely.
I'm really enjoying it. So, discussing a bit of a theme of what to talk about today. Two things that have been on our minds both recently: relationships and addiction. And there's actually a bit of an interplay between the two.
Absolutely. I think addiction can relate to, obviously gambling is the first thing that comes to mind, but obviously we're talking about relationships as well. And so the more prominent association to the addiction theme would be pornography and how that affects relationships.
The pornography point, like I think you and I both know a lot of men from various different friend circles that we've been a part of where pornography is like really changed. And I'm not even talking just like UK friends. I met people in the US, I met people all over the world where pornography has really like messed with them and their capacity to be in a normal relationship.
Yeah. And how so?
So I know, for example, one guy I met on my travels, and I actually found this like, once I realized it to be painfully obvious in retrospect. The cuckold fetish is like a huge thing.
Yeah.
And it's like growing.
Okay.
And I was thinking, I was like, why is this like growing? Like the idea of like cuckolding being like so counter to like your evolutionary imperative, right? Like you want to pass your genes on.
Yeah.
So to get into a mindset where you're excited by the fact you're not passing your genes on, it's like evolutionarily so backwards. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of hard to almost get your head around.
Yeah.
And I realized that because pornography is incredibly like inherently voyeuristic, you are always you're never the subject of it. It's always like a distal thing. Like you are over here watching that thing over there through a screen. Mm-hmm. It's obviously kind of inevitable that for some set of people who are highly kind of like into it, they will develop that fetish in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And it's so damaging. Like, people who like just cannot end up having normal relationships because their view of sex has been so twisted. And this is just one way in which pornography can twist your sense. And I think, in one way I really empathize with like boys and men on this, because like pornography is clearly an addictive issue that men struggle with more, right? Like because of our biological wiring, our need for like kind of the drive for like sex and so on from a young age drives like young boys to these free open websites, which as we're increasingly discovering are like insanely corrupt.
Yeah. Like
insanely corrupt. There's a whole like kind of thing coming out about like the conglomerates that own the majority of the pornography websites. And then from like 11, 12, I literally remember at school, people 11, 12, like showing pornography. Like, I'm sure you had the same thing. iPod Touch back in the day, on like someone's iPod Touch. It's before iPhones even. Well, they were out, but like nobody had them. And like, you're sitting there thinking like, okay, like 11, 12 years old, his unlimited access to like insanely hardcore pornography, that's got to derange you in some way. Yeah. I cannot, and I'm a libertarian. I think people who want to watch pornography should be able to do so. Yeah. But again, it's like, how much unfettered access do you allow to a highly addictive substance? Like we make cocaine illegal. We have a sugar tax in the UK. I'm not necessarily saying I know a good way to do this. I think ultimately you have to do this at the cultural level, which is something I'll come on to.
Yeah.
But I think to just drop it on a culture and say, good luck adapting to this, I think is really a tough point.
Jordan Peterson makes a very funny, I guess, quip about this, where he says, a 12-year-old boy can go online and see hundreds and hundreds of the most beautiful women from all over the world at his fingertips, which is way more than the most dominant, powerful king in the world that 150 years ago.
Yeah. Like the Emperor of Rome.
Yeah. It's just it's crazy the amount of access to and I guess your point that I kind of want to double click on, which is that point around what that does to the brain, having that much access. Is kind of and also I want to explore more how fetishes actually become fetishes, because the cuckold fetish that, like, let's just say, like, any given person might have, they didn't start with, you know, having that fetish. They gradually you know, became attracted to that. So what is that journey from, you know, when you're seeing porn for the first time to when you've developed a cuckold fetish?
Yeah.
Like, what is that journey that, like, someone must go through? For me, I think that it's basically starts from consuming so much porn that you are basically no longer turned on by, like, the typical stimuli that you might see in any given porn video. So then you look for something to, like, stimulate your interest, something novel, because ultimately that's what's going to trigger your dopamine receptors. And then when that little thing that you're watching just becomes slightly that absurd thing that you're watching becomes slightly part of your day to day, then you're like, okay, well, what else can I watch? And then what else? And then slowly,
it's like your coffee getting stronger every morning.
But you've got so many avenues to go down, I guess, with the fetish, right? Because there's people that have feet fetish, there's people that have MILF fetish, there's people that have all sorts of fetishes. Like, what drives someone to a cuckold fetish? And I guess we're just picking cuckold, but I mean this in a general sense. Like, what drives someone to a specific fetish? And is it do you think it relates to, like, what they've experienced growing up in their childhood?
It depends which, like, kind of like branch of psychology you like, right? I think Freudian psychology stipulates that a lot of the fetishes are formed before puberty.
Really?
Yeah.
So that fetish is already, like, latent in the brain.
Well, so then there's a bunch of theories, right? So if you look at the brain, the somatosensory cortex, which is the top of your brain, which deals with the input of sensory data from your skin. One theory is that because the bit of your brain that deals with the sensory input from your genitals is right next to the bit that deals with the sensory input from your feet, they're right next to each other. So one theory is that the wide prevalence of foot fetishes is because your capacity to feel pleasure in your genitals and your feet are right next to each other in your brain, basically.
Really?
So that's more of a physiological explanation as opposed to a psychological one.
Well, that would be a physiological explanation for just the foot fetish.
Yeah.
But is that not, I guess that's not transferable. That doesn't cross over to, like, a cuckold fetish.
Yeah, I don't see how that could, because that's like a very specific thing. This is my crackpot theory. I just think the cuckold fetish is a natural consequence of watching too much pornography, because inherently, what you're actually, like, desensitizing yourself to and getting yourself turned on by is the physical act of watching someone else have sex with the object of your desire.
Okay.
Which is inherent to the act of watching pornography, right?
Yeah.
Because it's never you; it's always someone else. And so if you just, like, desensitize, obviously it doesn't happen to everybody. Probably some people are more susceptible than others. But the most porn addicted people I know typically have some kind of cuckold fetish, I would say.
But then,
that's anecdotal.
But then wouldn't cuckold be like in top 5 like porn categories? Because surely you.
It's way bigger than you think, dude.
But I don't think it's in the top 5. Like it's not that big. I know it's big, but it's not like if for okay, like put it this way.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The people who watch porn the most are gonna basically like surely that category must be like super high because that's the thing that they're always watching.
Yeah.
But
what percentage of the population are the extreme addicts, right? It's probably a Pareto thing.
Yeah.
The same with the alcohol industry. Like alcohol and most addictive industries make gambling as well. They make most of their money from like increasingly smaller slices of the people, right?
Yeah. My thinking is that a cuckold fetish is because I think anyone that watches porn too much will develop some sort of like fetish, but it's not necessarily.
I don't think it's necessarily cuckold, to be fair.
I think that the cuckold fetish actually might stem from things that happen outside of your porn, like the addiction,
yeah,
like your like what happens in your life. Do you enjoy, getting told what to do by your boss at work type thing? That might bleed in. It might bleed into work, like that sort of fetish.
True.
Even like how you act with your girlfriend,
if you're predisposed to liking like neuroticism,
yeah,
or like really enjoying neuroticism, I could see that being like
yeah. But yeah, it's something that I've thought about. Like, how do, for example, like, there's so many sort of fetishes that exist, right? Like, like obese girls. That's like a fetish that some people would have. Like, what drives someone to like having that fetish?
Yeah.
And I think you have to look at basically what's common amongst these fetishes. And for me, the thing that's common is the thing that is so counterintuitive to what you might expect someone who's wanting to engage in a sexual act would find attractive in that person. So, for example, if I'm wanting to have sex with a woman, I'm gonna basically and let's just say I get to choose any woman that I want. I'm obviously going to choose someone. Well, it might seem obvious that I would choose someone that is that has like an athletic fit body, that is like obviously that looks somewhat akin to like a typical model that you might see in any
attractive, healthy,
like just attractive, like healthy person. Yeah.
But
these fetishes are actually the opposite of that. They signal the opposite of that. They signal end of genealogy, end of like if you engage with me, like your offspring, you'll either have no offspring or they'll be like screwed up essentially. So and those overlap. Basically all the fetishes that we named have just overlapped, basically, like obese, like cuckold.
That's why, again, specifically that cuckold thing to me is like so wacky, because it's like getting pleasure from ending your line. Anyways, I guess like one of the topics I was talking about with addiction is like I have all these ideas for Substacks. I feel like they're not enough for like a whole thing themselves.
Yeah.
But they are like interesting like to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm too organized. And so for example with the addiction thing, my theory is like kind of related to, let me just tee it up. There have been various cases like throughout human history where something addictive has been dropped on a society that had no cultural barriers for how to deal with that addictive substance. One example of this is the Native Americans didn't have much of like an alcohol brewing culture before the Europeans came along.
Yeah.
And so one of the things they brought along with them, outside of disease and guns and horses and all the other things, is alcohol. But Europeans, like part of the one theory is part of the reason they settled down to be agrarian and agricultural is in order to brew alcohol. So there's a long 10,000 plus year history of European society with alcohol.
Yeah.
So over that kind of long period of time, you build up certain cultural norms and barriers, like when is it appropriate to drink, when is it inappropriate to drink. Bear in mind, we come from the UK, which is a large binge drinking culture anyways. I'm not saying we figured it out, I'm just saying there's some kind of norms around it, right?
Yeah.
If you drop something super addictive.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, they also have no idea of the downside. Like,
Yeah.
people only like realize addictive things are bad for you over the long term. Like, alcohol doesn't kill you. It can kill you in one night, but typically it kills you over like 20, 30 years. You know what I mean? So you don't have that longitudinal kind of understanding, which the Europeans would have had because they've had centuries. You know, everyone knows the village drunk who drowned in his own sick.
Yeah.
Well, you end up what ends up happening is you drop this addictive substance on a society, and they have no cultural barriers, and so it takes a long time for those negative things to wash through, and for people to come to understand the ways in which their culture should constrain. The US went as far as temperance, for example, with alcohol, and a lot of that was like driven by like mothers, wives who didn't want to get like beaten, etc., etc. So my point is, like, when you have these like new insanely addictive things like pornography or Instagram or mobile phones or dating apps or whatever, like you're just dropping them on our culture, and we have to figure out how it's appropriate to use these things. And I've noticed already there's a lot of like culture that's emerged around phones that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. For example, none of us, like I'm almost never in a situation where I'm sitting at a dinner table and people are on their phones. 5-10 years ago, that would have been the case. Even my brothers, who are substantially younger than me, some cases like 6-7 years younger than me, like late teens, early 20s, would find it like rude and like weird, and they'd be like, "Why are you on your phone? We're having dinner." You know what I mean? But that's not something that. My point is, like, you drop this addictive substance. People aren't like entirely sure what the negative effects will be. And then over time, cultural barriers rise to kind of mitigate some of those downsides of that thing, right? Luckily, phones are like, they're obviously insanely addictive, but not like addictive in the way that like fentanyl is, or like kind of, you know, whatever, hyper acutely addictive in that way, substances. Another one is marijuana. I would say, like, I think it's only recently that, you know, obviously people have been smoking weed for a long time, but it's only recently become like widely available, insanely strong, and like readily accessible. And again, like, I think we're still like not sure what the negative side effects of that are going to be. Like, I mean, we've made space for it in our culture, right? As an adjacent thing to alcohol. But I think you and I both know people who became like catastrophic stoners. And it's like, clearly, like, you know, an addiction is like a little demon that's sitting on your shoulder. The mere fact that you're addicted to something is a little demon that kind of wreaks havoc in your life.
But I would say that almost like marijuana consumption has definitely gone through that process already, right? Because there was a point in time where it became highly taboo to like even say that you smoke weed. It was like treated as like basically the same as like taking heroin. For a lot of people, it's like it's the same, regarded the same like class of drugs, and I'm pretty sure it is in the UK actually in the same category as like Class A drugs.
It's Class B, I think.
Is it?
Yeah.
It's, I mean, like it's certainly when you're coming into the UK and you're at an airport with weed, like I'm pretty sure like the security will like treat you as if you've just brought in like cocaine or something. Like it's almost like treated with like that degree of, you know, severity.
But I don't mean like legally, because legally and culturally, I guess my point here is like,
no,
ultimately,
but
like,
I'm making a cultural point though, which is that over time policemen have become like more and more tolerant for people like smoking weed. They don't give a shit anymore, basically.
Like, people smoke weed and police walk past them and they don't like arrest them.
So I think it's already gone through that process where it's like, actually we don't need to be like that restrictive on like the consumption, and it's slowly like unwinding. But that point about how phones are sort of like almost going through that stage as well, where it's like people have that culture around using that technology is developing and it's maturing to a stage where like people know actually not to be on their phone during like dinner, like when you're at a family meal and things like that, which I think is good. But I think there's a lot of things that don't necessarily, like, for example, do you not think that we've had porn in our culture long enough that we should know what to do?
But I do see this emerging now, right? Like, NoFap, for example, is a cultural antibody that emerged in response, in consequence to an addictive stimulus.
Yeah.
There was no like broad kind of consensus movement that was outside of like purely religious,
Yeah.
which again like could be too extreme. Like there could be like some small amount of pornography that's fine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, but like NoFap, for example, is a cultural immune response to too much or pornography addiction, basically. And that's my point. Like the culture will develop memes that help navigate. And this is kind of off topic, but like I noticed this news story the other day. I had a stepbrother traveling to Colombia,
Yeah.
and there's all these like stories of like American gringos going to Medellin and trying to like sleep with a bunch of Colombian girls on Tinder and stuff. And I found this really interesting. This news story is basically like the local Colombian guys are basically like catfishing guys with like profiles and then robbing them. And I was like, these things, like you cannot have this like massive disadvantage for too long. You cannot just be like, okay, I'm a rich American who's going to come and like sleep with all of your women. Like the culture just won't tolerate it. There's going to be antibodies that start circulating, you know? And so this advantage is going to be equalized because the local people will be like, you're just coming here, you're diminishing my position in the sexual market. I want to rob you, basically. I want to stop you from doing this. I want to put the word out that it's risky to go on a date with a girl on Tinder or whatever in Medellin.
Yeah.
And so I would again call those like kind of the cultural antibodies that are coming out in force to neutralize this kind of like perceived massive gradient, basically.
Yeah. I find that interesting that a tourist would be higher in the sort of, would be regarded with higher status or as having higher status than a local.
Well, one, the wealth divide.
Okay.
Two, the possibility of leaving. But then three, also, I think things that are just different that are just inherently exciting, right? Like,
I think what I was going to say on the point about the about porn being, or sorry, about mobile phones. What was the point I was going to make? Yeah, sorry, about the sort of accessibility of porn basically being so accessible that it inevitably leads to addiction because there's no cultural guardrails around restricting our usage around it. I actually not sure that it's porn that is the issue, and it's actually the lack of purpose and meaning that a lot of people have in their lives. Like they just lack purpose, they lack meaning, uh, they lack a purpose for their life. They don't know what it is they're doing, what they're working for, why they have to work, what their ultimate goal is in life. And I think that's what's driving the excessive porn consumption, because I just played a thought experiment in my head, which is, okay, pick any rich, successful, wealthy person who has unlimited access to girls. And yeah, okay, some of them do falter, some of them do give in to their hedonistic whims. P. Diddy being the latest example of someone like that. But actually, the vast majority of them don't. And why don't they? Actually, why didn't they give into it? And that's because they have a greater meaning and purpose in their life. They're successful for a reason. It's because they're developing their own character arc. They've got a goal and they're heading towards something. And so they might have so many things heading their way, and like so many options and so many girls to like basically have sex with, and they don't even need porn. Like they've actually got physical bodies that they can easily have sex with if they wanted, but they choose not to because they don't need it, and because they know that that's actually not what their life is about. And I think giving in to that, giving into your hedonistic whims is actually a result of worshipping the wrong thing, which is actually putting your hedonistic whims, your impulses at the forefront of your life and saying, well, whatever I want to do, I'm going to do because, well, why not, basically. And instead, you should find...
It's a little bit related to nihilism, right? Hedonism.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is the same thing. Is skeptics are people who don't have anything to worship other than their immediate impulses, and it's a it's just self gratification. It's basically whatever I want to do it now because why not? And I think the counter to that is actually having greater purpose and meaning. And I think that that's the reason why people give in to a lot of addiction.
I'm going to challenge you there a little bit though, because I think you could have your meaning taken away from you from exogenous factors, right? Like I often think about this, like think about like the median individual. Like how easy is it for the median individual to be successful in your society?
Well, it depends what you define as successful.
I think simply like having the capacity to like hold down sufficient work, meaningful work,
Yep.
that you can support a family. I think it's pretty low bar. Like you can afford a place to live. You can go to work every day, like kind of have some pride in your work. Come home, like have sufficient capital to own a house and like support a family, and sufficient like security and stability in that.
I think a lot of people can manage that actually.
So I would, but the thing is, like, I would disagree with you where like you see a lot of this is where I want to challenge you is like a huge amount, in my view, of the, and it's not a controversial thing to say, like the drug addiction you see in the US, the like fentanyl and opiate crisis and stuff are from the areas that have been like deindustrialized, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've had the jobs leave their town.
Yeah.
This is literally where J.D. Vance came from.
Yeah.
It's like his book, Hillbilly Elegy, is describing this area.
Yeah.
And the capacity to have economic opportunity has,
Yeah.
like,
well, our equivalent would be like the north of England.
the north of England, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, you know, Sunderland or,
Yeah.
you know, northeast, right? Deindustrialized, once like kind of the center of arguably the world, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, again, like how hard should it be for the median individual to find sufficient work that, because you know, a lot of people say, oh, we'll just become an entrepreneur or learn to code, but like you misunderstand. And again, I'm not being like paternalistic or like kind of derogatory, but like it should be relatively, like people who want a job should be able to get one, which can give them sufficient money to support, you know.
Yeah.
I think if it's really hard for you to do that, like, you know, I'm not making excuses or anything, but I'm just saying, like, if it's that hard to like do it, that like just normal people can't do it. Like,
Yeah.
It's no wonder to me that people fill that meaning gap in their life with like drugs and pornography and like, you know, it's like an as if, you know what I mean? It's like it's the best you can do. Like,
Yeah. But I mean, I just have to push back because I just think it's the wrong way around. I think the meaning in your life comes first, and then things fall into place. Not if I had a job, then I would have meaning. You know, it would be the meaning in my life. I have purpose in my life, and I will spend my whole life trying to find a job if that's what it takes. But you've got the right thing first. You have to have the right stepping stones first. You don't put the cart before the horse, right? You've got to first understand what your goal and purpose in life is, and what is the thing that you're going to spend your whole life aiming towards. What is your North Star? And then and then you go out into the world, and the world therefore calls you to adventure. Not, well, I need to find that adventure first and that journey, and then that's what's going to be the source of my meaning. Because I think that's the same as basically putting your whims and your hedonistic impulses actually before. That's you're basically resorting to that to be the determiner of your next step in life if you don't have that North Star. And I think that there's a lot of people that in like, I mean, I come from Scotland. I come from a town that's full of like a lot of people that are cynical in life and don't believe that that the future is going to be great, and that they it's very natural to sort of like resort to impulses and stuff. And actually, I was reading something earlier today, which is about the book of Revelation, actually, in the New Testament, where there's a lot of like imagery that revolves around people's hedonistic whims, that as they approach the end of the world, obviously there's a lot of imagery about prostitutes and stuff that come up, and that's because what
Well, if
do
you think the
people
world's
think
going to
about?
end, yeah.
Yeah, what do people think about? What do people want to do when they're told that the world is going to end, or when they know that the world is going to end?
Try to experience everything they can possibly.
Yeah, exactly. It's all the things you could possibly want. You want to do them now and imminently. And I think that's how people act. People are acting as if the world is about to end and that the world is in decline. And I think that is the source of a lot of addiction and a lot of self gratification that we find in our society, which is why porn consumption is probably at its all time high. Why lots of people develop fetishes is because actually they're cynical and they don't believe that the future is going to offer them anything great. Deep down, I think that's what they think.
Yeah. I guess like, another example of that is like, how do you tie it back into relationships?
Yeah.
How do you project your relationship 20 years into the future if you're genuinely convinced the climate emergency is going to kill us all in the next 10 years? You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly. You have to live your life as if you're going to live forever.
So David Deutsch has these really like interesting thing called like anti-rational memes, which are memes you can instantiate that incapacitate your ability to reason your way out of them. So an anti-rational meme is a meme that kind of like disables your reason. If you see what I mean.
No,
so I think of an example.
That disables your reason.
So it's a meme that once you install it, you're unable to delete the meme, basically, because it incapacitates your ability to reason your way out of the meme. It's trying to give a good example. There's a lot of like religious examples, I think, where it's like kind of just like you just have to accept something, and you're not allowed to think your way out of it, basically, by definition.
Oh, okay.
You see what I mean?
Kind of.
I think there's a certain type of like climate change alarmism in a way.
Well, isn't actually that's what leftism is in a way? Like that's what the Democrat Party represents, is that when you're bought into like the Democrat Party, that is the meme, and so therefore you have to adopt to all their positions that they stand on.
But not everyone, right? Like,
but most people do. It's like, yeah, but if you don't, then you're not accepted into the club.
And totally the same on the right, though. By the way, right now, right? Like Trump just banned the Associated Press from the White House because they refused to say the Gulf of America. It's like, well, where's your free speech now?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, there's no like ownership of these anti-rational memes.
But I'd say the difference is that like you making like, I'm not saying that we're right or anything, but
like left-wing politics has gone through like.
But we can say that that's wrong. Whereas like if you're on the left, you don't really say that that's wrong. You don't really say that anything that they do is wrong.
That is just a very specific type of left-wing politics that we've had in the last like 15 years.
But it's the predominant sort of doctrine of the party at the moment. I would say. I wouldn't say that's necessarily doctrine of like the Republican Party.
But there's a lot of that on the right for sure.
There is a lot of it.
Like there's snowflakes on the right as well, right?
There are, absolutely.
All the things they accuse the left of being. Like, I think Tucker Carlson is the biggest like crybaby, basically. Like
yeah.
And like,
What I'm saying is though is that there's a lot of more variation on the right than there is on the left. On like you can be accepted on the right if you've got a differing point of view. They will still accept you, generally speaking.
I think you can broadly say with a coalition of like tech people and like old MAGA people, a lot more like fresh ideas are coming out of the right wing right now than are coming out of the left.
But even that example that you've just given, like there's the House is divided against itself, I guess, on like the Republican side, because there's a lot of like
the tech people are kind of more pro-immigration,
like traditional,
right?
Like MAGA people that actually don't hate the tech people being involved in Trump politics. Whereas like, but my point is like on the Democratic side, there's a one size fits all approach that they're having, and that's I'm trying to like think of an example to your main point, which is like you just have to adopt all these ideas. So
a kind of example of that would be like, this is like the truth and you cannot question it, basically.
Yeah.
That is the definition of anti-rational meme. It's like, well, hang on a second, like, why can't I question that?
Yeah.
Like, it could be wrong. Like, I need to interrogate that.
But has David Deutsch come up with an rational meme that is actually beneficial to the person that adopts that meme?
So I think,
or is it necessarily like to your demise if you adopt it?
it's potentially like beneficial to a group. I could see that, for example.
Okay.
But overall net benefit is bad.
Okay.
David Deutsch's like core point is like the only thing that's sustainable is progress, basically. Like progress is like there's no concept like sustainability. It's like, well, what are you trying to sustain? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You know, there's no like place you can freeze things where they will just stabilize and like not be able to. Like, the only thing that's sustainable is growth.
If you're not growing, you're declining.
Yeah, there's no like point you can come to you can freeze.
Yeah.
And his whole like kind of philosophy is about providing.
Sorry, that completely overlaps over on your favorite Bob Dylan quote.
Yeah, he not busy being born is busy dying.
It's the same
exactly.
thing.
It's the exact same thing. Like you have to be growing, right? Like even as a person, like you can like, you know, this. My brother, for example, started recently working at a bar, and there's this guy who's the exact same age as me who's working there at the bar, who kind of left uni and just kind of went to go work in the local pub.
Oh yeah.
My brother's doing it for a bit of cash so he can go traveling, and he's like observing this guy, and this guy's like same age as me, but he's still working in the same pub he worked at when he was like 21.
Yeah.
And he drinks every day. He's dating a girl he met at the pub who's like a few years younger than him, and there's no plans to leave this place. Like,
yeah.
In my view, that's busy dying.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
Interesting.
Like, because he, like, you know, it's like it's very judgmental in a way, like, you know, because that's my definition of like what I would be happy with. But if I was living that life, that would be a living hell for me.
Yeah.
Like, just in the same place, like no growth, no like capacity to learn more, like gain new skills, to like have more leverage, to like be more productive. Like, you know, the unit economic of like me spending 1 hour doing something becoming more and more valuable over time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
I'm just like fascinated with this idea. Actually, I really want to talk about it more because I don't think I agree. I think that him doing that and him being satisfied and fulfilled by doing that is actually the best thing that could happen, because I think, have a culture where actually there's a one size fits all definition of what success means, and basically by looking at that guy that's working at the bar, we think, well, according to my definition of success, like he's not basically fulfilling that. But then what happens when if he is like sort of made to feel guilty about his choices in life, and that he basically, well, he's like, okay, fuck it, I'm going to leave and I'm going to work somewhere else then, or get a job in the city. Then that pub in that village or town is basically doesn't have a bartender anymore, or at least not one that's sufficiently competent enough. I'm sure he knows the locals' names. I'm sure he's known by the locals. I'm sure if he's managed to maintain a job for like 4 or 5 years, then he must be, you know, good at it. And actually, what's not to say that it's not actually having knock-on positive effects to the village, actually, which is a positive thing. And so I think that him being there can actually facilitate growth in a very subtle way.
I mean, for me, I'm talking from myself. Like, there's lack of personal growth there, right?
But he's got a girlfriend that he met at the pub.
Yeah, he's fine. Like, you know, maybe the guy's miserable. Who knows? Maybe like doesn't like it. You know?
But like, assume that he's not though.
I assume that he's not.
There's not like.
But the interesting thing I think that happened was my brother came to me and saw this guy, and he saw this guy's trajectory, and was like, "Wow, that's kind of sad." In a way, you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, but I think that's typical thinking of people who are natural problem solvers, because I used to think like
there's definitely got to be a place in society for people who want to do that.
Absolutely,
I'm a freedom person.
Like people that like want to clean toilets, people that want to like they'll do the bins on like every
I'm also
Thursday.
not
It's like,
judgmental, by the way, about
I
like
know.
what people choose to do.
I know, but what I'm saying is, and I think you agree, which is like there's absolutely like there's a need for people to adopt those jobs, and I think what happens are people are like, well, come on, mate, you should like that job is a like people look at these jobs as temporary jobs, and that they should be fulfilled by people that are at a certain stage in life, but then at some point they graduate from that,
Yeah.
and they're not working a proper job. Exactly. But I think what we want to get to is a stage in society where those jobs are actually able to be fulfilled by people that are happy doing that like forever, and that they're able to sustain a girlfriend and a family with those jobs.
Yeah.
And using your equation of what sustain means, that meaning that they're growing in their life by having that job, that job is allowing them to
Have a family.
and stuff. And I think that, I mean, that's what it used to be like.
I think the thing. So
why can't we? And I think the aim for our society is to actually get to a position where people can actually grow a family, start a family, and grow in their life by being a barman for the rest of their life.
I know we don't want to like talk too much about politics. It kind of comes up. You kind of talk around it. But like, if I had to say like my core political opinions, like at its core, are like policies that get us towards a situation where housing is cheap and like not an investment. I can come on to that in a second. Energy is so cheap that it's not really a concern.
Yeah.
It's like cost of living stuff. You know what I mean? Like everywhere where like you see these things, like there's no like technological barrier whatsoever to housing being insanely cheap.
Yeah.
It's a policy decision.
Yeah.
There's no physical reason why we shouldn't have really cheap energy.
But
it's the outcome of a set of choices that we've made.
What do you think about this? One thing that I've sort of stumbled upon, and I don't know, I've not really formulated much thinking around this, but one thing I kind of stumbled upon was someone that said that the reason why what justifies housing being so expensive is that everything else in your life is cheap.
But the problem is, like, when everything else got cheaper, that should have resulted in excess stuff for you, right?
But it does, doesn't it?
So there's a really, really interesting Rory Sutherland point I've been engaging with recently, which is essentially his argument is that when women, if you take a household view, when women enter the workforce, what they gave up was about 35 to 40 hours of discretionary time for the house every week, right? The people who took that bargain at the beginning were really well off.
Yeah.
Because they went from having one income, which was enough to support a house, to having a second income, which was just added on top. Now, not only have we had, if you take that household view, I know everyone's got different situations, but like if you just take the view of like a standard like household, now everyone's lost 35 to 40 hours of time in a week because you need two incomes.
Yeah.
And not only that, everything.
It's supply and demand.
So basically, the housing prices have soaked up that excess productivity, right? And any extra wage growth you see in London is pretty tightly correlated with property increase, basically. And it's the same thing with like things getting cheaper. As everything else has gotten cheaper, housing has soaked up that productivity too, in a way, right? And so you ultimately end up in a situation where any like pay rise you get, any like excess like productivity you gain in the economy is just getting soaked up by the housing market.
Yeah.
And again, a really funny point Rory Sutherland makes is like he says, okay, like the fact that housing as a place to live is tied to this investment, i.e. the land underneath, which is in constrained supply, is basically like saying if you want to drive a car, in order to drive this Ford, whatever that you bought, you have to put $100,000 into Ford Motor Company shares in order to drive this car.
Yeah.
It's ludicrous. So you have to separate the two out.
Yeah. It is fascinating. Imagine like there was a new government bill where they basically said, right, we're going to give every single person $100,000 in order to put deposits in houses.
All the house prices will go up 100%.
Will go up by $100,000.
And this is the thing, like every time you hear a government scheme up until now, at least rhetorically, to help people like deal with this problem, it's always been on the supply side. It's always been saying, let's give younger people the capacity to do a 1% deposit instead of 10%, which is just going to drive price.
So then, really, what we're saying is the only solution to solve this is actually
supply
to increase the supply of houses
drastically. The problem is, one, I think this country, 40% of people own houses, and a lot of them have their like net worth tied up, a huge portion of net worth tied up in housing, including both of us, by the way, huge part of our net worth. Second, and I actually think this is the bigger consideration. It's not just the voters, but like I was running this like mental experiment today. Let's say there's like roughly $1 trillion worth of housing, £1 trillion worth of housing in the UK. The average loan to value on that property, i.e. the amount of like equity to debt ratio, is probably around 40-50%. You know, I have LTV of like 90, let's say, because I only have 10% deposit. Someone later in their life has paid it off. Let's say roughly it's in the middle overall, right? So LTV of roughly like 50, 60. That puts around £500 billion of mortgage debt that's baked into the UK economy. What happens now, because housing is incredibly inelastic, you need a place to live. So you're willing to pay whatever it takes. Therefore, like 1% changes in supply or demand can fluctuate the price like 2, 3, 4%. That's like the definition of inelasticity in a way. If you increase the supply 10%, that could tank the property value by 30, 40%, let's say. What happens to all that mortgage debt that's secured against houses at value X? So my theory is actually that the biggest losers in that case would be the banks. Obviously us, right? But the banks.
Well, yeah, but that goes back to your point, which is a house shouldn't be an investment.
It shouldn't be an investment. But part of what makes an investment as well is the fact that guys like you and me can borrow, you know, 250 grand or whatever the case may be to buy a house. Like, you know, I'm just a guy. You know, it's like here's £250,000. You know.
What about what do you think about a possible solution, which is not allowing foreign investment into UK housing? Because that way, that's one way of limiting, of almost increasing the supply, is actually limiting drastically demand.
Yeah, I think, like, you know, I think this doesn't actually like address the problem, because it doesn't address the renting problem, really.
Okay.
The only way to really address the renting
problem. What's the renting problem?
Is that renting is also massively increasing, right?
Okay.
And then obviously with interest rates going up, those landlords are passing their there's increased interest costs onto the tenants, right? Like, you don't want to be the guy at the bottom of the bottom of the pyramid, right? Because you know, the bank gets increased costs, they pass it on to the landlord. The landlord gets increased costs. You know, you want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be the guy at the very bottom. But like, unfortunately, like, because housing is so prohibitively expensive, that's where most people are. They can't like get enough money together to put a deposit together, or whatever the case may be, right? So I agree that probably will help suppress prices a little bit. But I don't think it's like, I think it's a bit of a sticking plaster. I think that the core problem is lack of supply. And I actually think if you really want to decouple the investment from the house, what you really want to do is decouple the value of the land underneath the house from the house itself. And the only way you can do that is a land value tax, which is basically to tax the value of the land itself. Which, so for example, there's a really good, I'm really interested in like Georgism right now. We would talk about it like on and off. And there's so many different like domains that you can apply Georgism to. And we'll take housing now, but I'll give you some other examples. Georgism basically is like a remedy for situations where there's a first mover advantage. Like the Duke of Westminster, who owns Mayfair, like pretty much all of it. Now, he is just a guy who happens to be the descendant of a guy whose ancestor was in the right place at the right time with the right friends 400 years ago. You know, like, that's bullshit. Like, the guy doesn't really have to do anything productive with the land to just rake in rents. You know. And it's not like he's like the Duke of Wellington or like some like aristocrat that's like a big hero or like done something like courageous or like outstanding for the country. He's just like a property developer now, basically. And I'm not against property development itself. I'm against just like banking land. And then I guess the problem with this is like, okay, here's another example. There's a Russian oligarch who bought an abandoned tube station in, I think, North London somewhere, basically. And he didn't do anything with this. This is beautiful old oxblood tile. It must be one of the closed Bakerloo line stations. Leslie Green designed. There's oxblood tiles. And it was just like sat there closed. The guy just bought it, freehold. And in the meantime, after he bought it, all these little businesses pop up around it, right?
Yeah.
Where they're actually increasing the value of his land because they're making it a nicer neighborhood. They're investing. The guy opens up a coffee shop, a dental practice. People are making it like, you know, a nicer place to live. Their tax is going to pay for like, you know, whatever. Increases his property value. He doesn't have to do shit. He just has to sit there and like basically essentially parasitize of other people's productivity. And benefit and reap the rewards. And the idea with Georgism is to decouple that. Another really good example of this is web URLs. There's a huge community of people who just buy and bank URLs for websites in the hope that one day they can become more valuable. And as people do productive things on the internet, inherently their URLs become more valuable. They don't have to do anything with that web domain. And eventually they just sell it. There ought to be some kind of mechanism to say, if you want to have this, you have to do something productive with it. You can't just sit on it and like kind of do nothing.
But no, I agree. So like in theory, then like the landlord that owns the land to where a successful restaurant might be, they might, for example, in theory, like pay the taxes of that restaurant, basically.
So they would have to pay a tax in proportion to the value of the land of the restaurant. And so only people who are doing productive things for the land would end up owning that land because otherwise, that's a theory. The idea is you'd have to phase this in as well, right? Like, but yeah, I'd like to do like a bit more like digging on like how this would work in practice for like residential stuff. Maybe we can do a podcast on it as well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've not looked into it at all really, but I do like the idea in principle. It's very libertarian.
It's basically, yeah, exactly. And the thing is like, Henry George's idea was the only tax you would need would be the land value tax. No income tax, nothing else. Because it's inherently linked to the productivity of the economy, right? So, and the other thing is like, you and I should be upset that like, in a way, the tax money that we pay to the government that goes to build Crossrail 2, the new line across London, has massively increased the property values of all the people who are around the stations. But you don't see a slice of that. You know what I mean? Like, a really interesting point, and I think this is bonkers to me that we did this and have forgotten about it, is when they were building the Central line, if you look at all these like weird distal like stations, you know, all the way, Ruislip or like Thaden Boys, you know, part of the way they financed the railway was they bought like thousands of acres of land around the planned route, put a station there, developed the land into properties, and then sold the properties to people who wanted to commute into London. And that's how they pay, part of how they paid for. And like you look at HS2, it's like we can't fund it. It's like, why don't you just do that too? Like create a new station between London and Birmingham. That's now a commuter town because you got a high-speed rail going directly into Euston.
Well, defeats the purpose of it being high speed.
Well, you obviously don't want too many stops, right? You want like maybe one stop, let's say, and you create a new town, new economic center. You make a lot of money to fund the railway, and it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. Anyways,
I mean, I love that idea in principle. I can just imagine the sort of people that would be
against it.
That would be located to that town.
Well, you cover a bit of a commuter town yourself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I come from Livingston, and it's definitely a commuter town, but it wasn't originally that. It was originally a mining town, a mining village, Livingston Village, and then it grew outwards into.
Was it named after David Livingstone?
I think it was. I don't know.
Have you read about David Livingstone much?
I haven't, no, but I don't think it is. Does I think David Livingstone's name ends in an E, right?
Maybe.
Whereas like this is Livingstone, so it's not Stone.
You would love David
But,
Livingstone.
yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about David Livingstone.
David Livingstone was a Victorian explorer
Yeah.
who was an evangelical Christian, basically. And a huge part of his identity was he went on a mission to South Africa to try do what you do on a mission, right? Which is to convert people, basically.
Right. Okay.
And he became this big like explorer who just went off on his own. He took his family, like, young kids as well, wife, way up into like along like up South Africa, way up, and he like kind of discovered the Victoria Falls.
Okay.
And he named them the Victoria Falls, obviously after Queen Victoria. And he just went on this like insane adventure throughout Africa. His kids died, his wife died, he lost everything. But he became this great hero, Victorian like explorer, basically, for discovering all these parts of Africa. And ultimately was doing it in the name of like what a lot of Victorians did anything in, which was the name of evangelical Protestantism, basically.
And Victoria.
And Queen Victoria. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I knew he was an explorer, but I didn't realize he went to South Africa.
And he went all the way up to like Zambia, discovered the Victoria Falls. Fascinating story. So
relationships and addiction.
Yeah.
Do you think that? What do you think are the remedies against like addiction?
So there's two like instinctive levers people try to pull. The first is the legal lever. It's like what can we ban? The second is the cultural lever, which I think we neglect, to be honest, a little bit.
So bottoms up versus
Top down.
bottoms up versus top down. And I think in general we're tending as a society towards a top down approach for everything, basically, which has been perpetuated by COVID, obviously, but
it was before COVID as well, to be fair.
That definitely, yeah. I think COVID definitely like sped things up, and also set a huge precedent for a lot more top-down action, where a lot of people like complied. What do you think the bottoms-up approach would look like in theory?
The problem is like the bottoms-up approach is very slow, and like, for example, like NoFap is a good example. Like you have to find a mimetic way to spread a movement of people voluntarily giving up something that's short-term pleasurable in pursuit of a better long-term life, right? In a way, you almost have to have people like bottom out and realize. I've read awful stories online of guys with like a horrific porn addiction who just genuinely like lost like sensitivity and all these other aspects of their life, whatever. My concern is like, to what extent do you have to go through that as a culture to, you have to like see the long-term negative effects before people are willing to give up this positive pleasure, right? Our generation is dropping drinking in droves.
I think one theory I've heard about why that's happening is because they look at their parents drinking and like taking drugs, and they're like, well, that's like an old person thing to do. I'm not doing that. I'm new and cool. And I think there's a lot of rejection of like old traditions and old practices, but at the same time there's also, I think we're seeing a cultural shift, especially in young people, of they're almost embracing as well things that are obviously not part of this part of a new ideology that is, like I guess like far leftist wokeism type thing. They're also rejecting that as well, but they're also, so there's a bit of an embrace of like traditional values, but there's also
doing it their own way,
but also doing it their own way, but also rejecting like things that their parents said and parents did.
Can I just say, by the way, like people like shit on Gen Z a lot, but like, how radical is it that a generation's like rejecting drinking? Like that is a core part of like pretty much every Western country's culture ever, like for all of history. Like that is a radical thing. I think they don't get enough credit for. It's like that is a big move,
Yeah.
So I see the downsides of this. I mean, let's say it's like having a nice little sip of whiskey. Like it takes like that's like a big thing to reject. I also think part of it is economic. Like,
I actually think it's a phase. I think it's the same thing that we saw with new atheism, because you would have said the exact same thing 20 years ago, which is how crazy that suddenly there's a new wave of young people that are just rejecting religion, not even rejecting it, but like anti it. But then we're seeing it come back a lot. I think we're going to see it come back.
But I think the difference there is like religion doesn't directly relate to your health in a way that I actually think so. There's a couple of reasons I think people are giving up alcohol.
Yeah.
One is this kind of like, okay, maybe there's like an emotional rejection of everything our parents are about. Two, economic.
Mm-hmm.
Going to the pub is fucking expensive.
It is.
It's £7 for a pint. In a lot of places, like you can't just, especially if you're economically squeezed already, you can't just go for a pint and not think about it. Like it's £7 is like the price of your lunch. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
and like it's expensive. You know, for one drink.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is people are getting very health obsessed.
Yeah.
In general, like the access to high quality health information is huge. Like anyone can load up Huberman or like Brian Johnson or whatever. I mean, smoking wasn't even bad for you until like what, the 70s?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Obviously, it was bad for you, but like it wasn't like thought to be. I think about how long after realizing or like understanding just how bad smoking is for you, it took for people to kind of give up smoking, even for them to ban smoking in like restaurants and pubs. You know what I mean?
Well, that's an interesting actually link to what we're talking about, because that was obviously a top-down approach.
Yeah.
Do you think that was necessary?
I think I'm actually, as a libertarian, in favor of banning smoking in public places.
Interesting.
Because of the externality of the smoke. So where I think government force is justified is in places where the externalities of your behavior impact other people.
Yeah.
And not even necessarily like in a way that's like directly linked to you. Here's a fantastic example of this, is leaded petrol.
Yeah.
Leaded petrol is a great example of like a fantastic regulation. Like, it was putting loads of lead in the soil, the environment. It led to a massive decrease in IQ. There's some theories that led to a massive increase in serial killers.
Okay.
There's women walking around like pregnant, inhaling lead, all the time. Like, this is not like, and like to the driver, like obviously they suffer too to an extent, but like not directly,
Yeah.
in the same way that like, they are suffering, but like they're making everyone else's problem too.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same thing with smoking inside. Like if you want to smoke outside, God bless, have a good time. Like I also think they're being too restrictive on smoking, for example.
Okay.
Like, these kind of things where it's like anyone born after a certain date will never be allowed to buy cigarettes. Is obviously going to fail. A, it's obviously going to fail, but B, it's just like anti-freedom. Like if you want to smoke cigarettes and hurt yourself, God bless, have a good time. But like, if you really want to end smoking or end drinking, you have to take a cultural approach.
Yeah.
The US did a fantastic job. I mean, like it or not, like of reducing smoking. It's basically through like huge amounts of propaganda.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's the cultural approach. You don't have to propagandize people for a cultural approach either. I think NoFap is a great example of a bottom-up rejection of a culture that encourages consumption of addictive material.
Okay. So I guess that leads us like almost full circle to like how we began, which is like porn, and like should there be some sort of like tax, to access porn? Like maybe like if you want to consume porn, then you have to pay like 1% extra income tax.
Yeah. I think firstly what you have to do is stop the porn sites. From the acute problem is, what is the exact relationship between the increase in human trafficking we've seen and the need for porn sites to have as much content as possible?
Yeah.
Personally, I think there's a link there.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of people who are trafficking people. I mean, Andrew Tate's an example, to create porn content. And I think that incentive has to be removed, basically.
Okay.
There's a lot of young women being kidnapped. Like, this is just a moral travesty.
Yeah.
Like, in service of what? Like,
yeah.
Just like money, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the acute problem, I think. Okay, then we can get into the cultural problem. In a way, like, I'm not in favor of, like, you having to like identify yourself on the internet. I think anonymity is like a good thing. It's obviously a bad thing. There's like upsides and downsides, but I think the downside of you being 100% traceable all the time on the internet is probably greater than the upside of that. Australia's just done this, by the way, to try prevent underage kids from going on social media. They put a law in.
Okay.
Again, like, why does the state have to say it's the law that kids under 16 can't go on Instagram? I know what the exact law is there. Like, why can't all the parents get together and take responsibility and say, because the ultimate out is like saying, oh, well, his mum lets him do it.
Yeah.
If all the parents got together and made a WhatsApp group saying, we are a group of parents against this, and none of us are going to allow our kids to do this, basically, then none of the kids are missing out. You know what I mean? But you're basically like inherently like saying you have no agency in the situation.
Yeah.
Daddy, come do it for me, basically, government. In a way, like pornography, like, you know, it's that old adage where it's like, I don't mind like if the parents in a house are like the communist dictators of that house. You know what I mean? Like, you set the filters on the router, you set the contract on the phone, whatever the case may be. Like, and then also like you need to like, up until now, there's not been a massive discourse in the culture about porn actually being super bad, right? Like people are like, oh great, you're like, if I want to do that in my own house, like, you know, that's fine. And that is fine. But you need to like counterbalance that and say, maybe get some porn addicts out and like say, put them on video and say like, this is how this fucked me up, like maybe forever, you know, and it's taken me years to get out of it. I think that's a cultural approach. That's propaganda.
That's
you need a bit of like propaganda, as I call it, like positive propaganda, like.
And I guess the super long-term approach, which would be the one that I'm in favor of, which is actually
destroying the want for people to do it in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
is you need to basically substitute it with something else, because ultimately what it is an aim for you're trying to feel fulfilled. It's a fulfillment.
You're filling a hole.
Yeah, filling a hole. Exactly.
You're filling some kind of hole.
It doesn't matter what hole it is, but you're filling a hole, and you got to figure out the right hole to fill.
The porn hole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you said this earlier. You didn't use these words, but sacrifice today for the tomorrow, essentially.
I think in general, as a rule, you do much better when you create volunteers and not conscripts.
Yeah, exactly.
If people resent being told what to do, I mean, at least I do. I'm like, you know, I have a little, you know, authority, like kind of me and authority have an interesting relationship.
Yeah.
You know, I'm much more likely to do something if you compel me to do it if you convince me to do it, then you compel me to do it.
Yeah.
Way more likely.
Yeah, well, that's what
I'm also going to tell other people about it.
Yeah. That's what the film Inception is about.
Yeah.
It's about someone that, like, basically wants someone to do something, and he's like, well, the best way to get them to do it is if I can convince them that it was their idea.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we need to do in society, is actually create, not create, but like just basically remind people of like actually what their genuine inherent purpose is in life, and remind them that actually, like, you don't want to be watching porn. The person who's addicted to porn knows that he doesn't want to be watching porn. He knows that.
He knows he's hurting himself.
He knows it's hurting himself. But you just we need to find some sort of way for them to sort of like wake up and sort of just learn, you know what, I don't want to be doing this. And for some people, that's their experience of like smoking cigarettes. Like they can smoke until like they're 50, 55, and one day be like, you know what, I'm not happy with this, and they can just quit. But yeah, obviously for a lot of people, they struggle with it. I think, yeah, finding genuine purpose in life is the true way that we're gonna change the culture around it. I think, rather than, because I'm also very libertarian. I'm not necessarily in favor with top-down approaches on a lot of situations.